take a look at Venezuela's renewed claim to 3/4 of Guyana's territory, which it has designated as Zona de Reclamación, or Reclamation Zone. Before we dive into a panel discussion on the topic, take a look at this montage of clips found on YouTube to get a better idea of what the international community are saying, and to demonstrate the rise of fringe groups in Venezuela, with thousands of followers seeking to make the reclamation of Essequibo a reality. We begin by taking a look at a more recent incursion into Guyanese territory by a group calling themselves Mi Mapa de Venezuela, Incluye nuestro Essequibo, or Mi Mapa Venezuela includes our Essequibo. This group is one of the more hardline outfits that have sprung up in recent years around the idea Venezuela was cheated out of Essequibo in an 1899 tribunal to settle the matter. The group have been active in disseminating information to and encouraging youth to engage with the issue, and have sought to network with both political and military figures in the hope of forwarding their objectives. I speak today with Carlos Spick, a member of the Mi Mapa group, which made the much publicized illegal entry into Guyana at Eteringbang with armed Venezuelan soldiers in 2013. As a participant in this territorial incursion, even as a member of the diaspora living in Boston, I asked Carlos about the view being propagated in Venezuela, which disregards the outcome of the 1899 tribunal as void, and whether the actions of groups such as his are linked to the deep political and economic instability at home. Also, we must ask the question of ourselves, as evidenced in the video posted online by the group, claiming the Eteringbang incursion was an exercise of Venezuelan sovereignty, showing interactions with Guyanese and GDF personnel. We must ask ourselves whether a failure to educate our own youth on the history of this controversy is in our best interest, or if it has the potential to lead our citizens into potentially compromising situations. Let's get off the fence, have a look at these videos, then head into the studio.
Huh? No picture. Because from since yesterday I hear them they take no picture. They can't take a picture over there. Because I don't take a picture over there, man. Must tell them. Hey, no photograph. I don't take a photograph. No photograph. You could have got me something, you know, Freddie.
This morning I go.
When these people don't start rolling. Because this morning, man.
Because I cannot live without money.
And it's very difficult to live there.
No, it's simple. Because I get contact with Venezuela and charity. You understand me? I love Venezuela. But
you love Venezuela?
I love Venezuela, but I never get the opportunity to live in Venezuela.
You want to live in Venezuela?
Yes, if I get the opportunity, I will glad to live in Venezuela.
We're going to try to do that with the government, with the Venezuelan government.
Well, thank you, my brother. I love Venezuela. Yes, my brother.
Me too.
Yes.
Can we take us a picture, a photo?
Yes, my brother. Yes, my brother.
Aqui nessa cidade.
Sorry for the...
Less than ideal presentation.
It's great. Okay. Thank you, my friend.
Now to growing tensions between Venezuela and Guyana. Venezuela is accusing its neighbor of a dangerous provocation. Guyana calls Venezuela a threat to regional peace.
The question of who owns these waters and the oil beneath them is causing increasingly serious diplomatic tensions between Guyana and Venezuela.
And so by doing this action, by creating a military zone, which essentially empowers Venezuela to sail military vessels into that area, not that they will, mind you, but just the threat of sailing military vessels there is likely to dissuade future exploration. And
President David Granger, in an unprecedented move, addressed the National Assembly on Thursday during the fourth sitting of the 11th Parliament on what is termed a matter of national importance. The purpose of the address was to bring the House, and by extension the nation, abreast with developments in relation to the decrees issued by the President of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. According to the president, the decrees issued by that country has impinged on Guyana's sovereignty and the country's rights to its exclusive economic zones.
United States Ambassador to Guyana designate Perry Holloway says the U.S. is monitoring closely the ongoing controversy with regards to the recent claims by Venezuela on Guyana's territory.
The fighting over territory between Venezuela and Guyana has found new footing.
The president of Venezuela said on Monday, in a special parliamentary session in Caracas, that he recalled the country's ambassador to Guyana for consultations as the bilateral border dispute continues to escalate.
The territory dispute between Guyana and Venezuela, well, that goes back more than 100 years. Guyana is just towards the east of Venezuela. And sitting here, it used to be a Dutch colony, then it was a British colony. It's the only English-speaking country in the whole of South America. Next door, we have Venezuela, a former Spanish colony. So along here is the Essequibo region, and this line border here was decided back in 1899 by International Tribunal. And it was decided that all of this area here belonged to Guyana. Let's fast forward until a few months ago when ExxonMobil discovered oil just off the coast of Guyana. That was when President Maduro of Venezuela, well, he said it is time to take back our land. So this area here, the Essequibo region, going back to Venezuela, which left just one-third of Guyana left for Guyana.
The matter with Venezuela was resolved by International Tribunal over 115 years ago. And Venezuela has revived this claim purely for internal political purposes.
We live under extremely unsafe conditions, and not only here. It's not a secret that the whole country is extremely unsafe. The slums have organized themselves and the gangs have joined forces. According to what is said in the slums or in social media, they've done so because they're tired of having police come and take all their things. That's why they've joined forces, to eliminate the police. I think it's good, but ultimately I don't put a lot of faith in this because it feels like they're putting a band-aid to stop a hemorrhage.
Hello and welcome to this week's Off Defense, where we are joined in studio by Mr. Aubrey Norton, former UG lecturer and Foreign Service officer, and Mr. Rawle Lucas, who are joining us in studio to discuss the Guyana-Venezuela territorial controversy that has been popping up in the news of late. Before I get to engaging our fantastic guests, I'd like to show you a little clip of a Skype video that I recorded with a member of the Mi Mapa de Venezuela, Incluye nuestro Essequibo group, which translates to mean My Map of Venezuela includes our Essequibo. So I caught up with one of the members online. He's a Venezuelan living in Boston, and we had a little bit of a conversation where I sought to garner his views and perspectives as a member of this movement on the history of the conflict. And after you have a look at that, we'll be back in studio to start the discussion, and no doubt we'll have a very lively one. Back in a minute. Thanks for agreeing to have an interview with me today on the issue of the Guyana-Venezuela border conflict.
Sure, no problem.
We met a few months ago, actually. It might be even a year, through the Real Guyana page, and I came to find out about the group called Mi Mapa de Venezuela, Incluye nuestro Essequibo. Have I gotten that right?
Yep.
Which literally translates to our map of Venezuela includes our Essequibo. So, having looked through your website, I looked through the work of the Mi Mapa group, and I recognized that there was work being done even in kindergartens. There's a lot of public awareness work being done, and there are people that take this quite seriously in Venezuela. Now, understandably, the Guyanese perspective would be that Essequibo is and always has been Guyana, but today on the program I want to look at both sides of the conversation so everyone understands fully the context and what's going on. So I'd like to give you an opportunity to share your perspectives on this ongoing conflict, and perhaps ways you imagine we could resolve this in a peaceful manner. So Perhaps you could start by telling us how you came to be involved with the Mi Mapa group, or
So I became involved with the Mi Mapa group thanks to my friend Petar Hergetik. Maybe you have seen him also in the group. He's very outspoken about the matter, and he was the one who introduced me to the topic in 2009. And afterwards, I found this group of Mi Mapa and saw their posts and joined the group and have been publishing in that page ever since.
so what's your understanding of the history of this conflict or this disputed territory?
So what I understand about the dispute is that it started in 1841 with the publication of the maps by the botanist Robert Schomburg, in which he was the, maybe I don't know if you've heard of him. He was the surveyor sent by the British to set the boundary between the colony of British Guiana and Venezuela at that time. So he published this map where he made a line that in which he took land west of the Essequibo River, which Venezuela claimed at its own as its own, and which Britain, and the issue was that Britain in 1825, when Venezuela was part of Gran Colombia, had recognized the Essequibo River as the to them western boundary between Gran Colombia and British Guiana. So, as you know, Venezuela seceded from Gran Colombia afterwards, and they went to the British to confirm that that was the line that separated each one country from the other. The British in turn sent Robert Schomburg, who published this map annexing for the British a piece of land west of the Essequibo River, and Venezuela naturally protested it. So the British at first said that the line was merely provisional, that it did not involve any annexation of land that was claimed by Venezuela, nor it did entail any renunciation by the British of any sovereignty of that land. And as a measure of good faith, the Prime Minister at that time, who I believe was Lord Salisbury or Aberdeen, I frankly don't know the name at this moment, he, as a measure of good faith, decided to completely remove the line. And in 1648, they signed the Treaty of Munster, where they say that whatever was colonized by Spain belongs to Spain in the Americas, whatever was colonized by the Netherlands in the Americas belongs to them. And among those things that they conquered in South America was the colony of Dutch Guiana. So, and that colony of Dutch Guiana was, and with the Captaincy General of Venezuela at that time, or the colony of New Granada, because Venezuela technically did not exist at that time, they bordered each other on the Essequibo River. The Dutch many times tried to cross over the river and expand their dominions westward, and the Spanish in turn, each and every time, they repelled them. They complained to the Dutch authorities, and in turn they sent to their soldiers to expel the Dutch settlers.
It's ironic to me that we start the discussion from the point where Venezuela is saying, okay, the Spanish came here. You started with the Dutch coming to the continent. When if we were to look at this with a more expansive humanist view, you could technically say the continent belonged to the natives that belong there, the Amerindian and the indigenous people. So if we were to go back in time to restore boundaries as they were once written, and we could even go back further to the supercontinent Pangaea, not to be facetious, but if we were to go back in time to redraw boundaries, wouldn't we have to start with going back to designating tribal boundaries for the original inhabitants of these lands? And on those grounds, is it not odd that after the span of more than 100 years, this is something that you're still holding on to?
Well, I mean, if we're going to go so far back in time, then we might as what we should do in an ideal scenario, I guess, is everyone who descends from everyone who's not a Native American basically has to leave the Americas and go back to wherever they came from.
So I would leave you to
So,
go on.
but of course, that is unrealistic, and the reason
Okay,
for which
well,
I go back
something you
the reason for which I go back to the colonization of the Spanish and the Dutch is because because the whole issue starts there, and the proof that that land belonged to Spain and then to Venezuela is there.
But who designated? I know there was a papal decree.
Yeah.
Which by order of the Pope,
yeah,
he basically divided up lands and said, okay, well, South America, you can have that Spanish guys, and Portugal, you can take control of territories in Africa. And then there was a lot of fighting. The Dutch, the French got involved. There was the era of exploration, and arguably people went around, say, Christopher Columbus, and they said that they discovered people, but we know now in a modern reading of history that it's not possible to discover other people. And what was actually happening was thinly veiled acquisition. It wasn't even thinly veiled, it was acquisition of land, it was genocide, it was a very horrible period in human history. So it is ironic that the story always starts from this papal decree having given people rightful ownership of a continent, and to this day we then fight over a line that has been drawn in the sand. Why after so many years is this something that is still being used? I guess the question I want to ask is there any link to is there any political motivation behind this? In terms of, we know right now Venezuela does not have the best economy. World oil prices are at a record low, and there is a lot of political and economic instability. There's some corners that are saying the recent moves to have people at the border and the like are a show of force and trying to shore up some of the political tensions at home by deflecting aggressions to a neighboring state. What would you say to this?
Well, I don't think there are political motives behind the reclamation, because Venezuela has been claiming this land since, well, as far back as the 19th century, and then since 1966. And because at first we were being robbed, and then we found evidence that the tribunal, which made what you know today as the border, was a sham. So no, there aren't any political motivations on it. I mean, and no, that we're doing it because we have a legitimate reason to say that the Essequibo is ours.
It was shocking to me to come across the Mi Mapa page and realize there are Venezuelans who actually believe the same thing. I saw a video on the page which seemed to me to demonstrate that it is more than people simply reliving the past, and there is some amount of activism around this whole endeavor. I saw a video where members of the Mi Mapa group actually came across the border, and I saw them communicating with a GDF soldier. More recently, we've had a series of back and forth. Guyana has discovered some oil, which others are saying this is another, is this something else that is playing into the issue? What's your involvement been in these activities, and how far do you think Venezuela should go in protesting these borders? Do you think the use of force is legitimate?
So, question by question, I have been involved a lot in these activism groups. I've been to conferences and seminars and posts on Facebook and social networks about what's going on with the reclamation.
So there's a lot of activity around this. I mean, I know the group has 16,000 or so members on the Facebook page.
Yeah, I would say there's a lot of activity on it. We've even tried to speak. We've even spoken to people on the government, and we've criticized some moves that they made. We've also congratulated on other measures that they have made. And to come back to your question of whether the use of force is necessary to do this, I don't think that the use of force is necessary, but I don't think that neither party should adopt an intransigent position where they are simply not willing to negotiate, because then what we reach is a deadlock and the reclamation simply will go on and on and on.
This week I'm joined in studio once again by Mr. Aubrey Norton, and he's here in his capacity as a former lecturer and a foreign service worker and a vast repository of knowledge on all things Guyanese. And we're also joined by Mr. Rawle Lucas, who is also a lecturer and columnist. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining me in studio today.
Thank you.
So this week on Off Defense, we'd like to speak about something that's somewhat of a pressing issue of late, which would be the Guyana-Venezuela territorial dispute. Before the camera started rolling, Mr. Norton was very pointed about pointing out that people often confuse the fact that this is a territorial dispute with it being a border issue. They say it's a border issue. So I'd like to start off by asking you to give us some context to the history of this Guyana-Venezuela dispute, because most people, especially most young people that I've encountered, understand this issue as nothing more than not a blade of grass. Whenever Venezuela says they would like to reclaim the Essequibo region, people post not a blade of grass songs to Facebook. And if you ask most people, it seems not everyone, maybe people in the older generation, understand the roots of the issue, and it concerns me that that should not be the case. So could you start by giving us a rundown of your understanding of the roots of this issue, Mr. Norton?
I thought rather.
Well, the floor is open, whichever you would.
Now, first of all, one has to understand the historical context in which it emerged. Guyana was a colony of British Guyana. Venezuela was already independent because most of Latin America became independent in the first quarter of the 19th century. Guyana and Venezuela, in this case through the British, had agreed as a result of a 1997 treaty to take the issue of the Guyana-Venezuela border to an arbitral tribunal. The documents are there to show that Venezuela agreed to the persons who constituted the tribunal.
Mm-hmm.
The tribunal met, and in 1899, an award was made clearly stating that where the territory of Guyana is and where the territory of Venezuela is. Further action was taken, and if I remember clearly, in 1931, they agreed on the tri-junction point, where Guyana, Venezuela, and Suriname met. The point where the three countries met, based on
Brazil,
Brazil, Guyana, Venezuela, and Brazil. What did I say?
Suriname.
Guyana, Venezuela, and Brazil. Establishing clearly where the point at which the three countries met, and that was in consonance with the arbitral award. I think as well, in the 1905 documents, they had clearly stated in writing where exactly Guyana is, where exactly Venezuela is, and where exactly Brazil and what territory they have. That process went on for years, with Venezuela accepting that the arbitral award of 1899 was final. One has to also recognize that in 1970, the USSR emerged. As a result, what happened is the world became divided into East and West.
During the Cold War.
The East, well, the Cold War effectively came after 1945. I'm coming to that. East and West. The Soviets controlling the East and the United States controlling the West. After World War II, and more particularly after the Truman Doctrine, the world ended up in a Cold War, in which the communist world was pitted against the free capitalist world, for the want of a better say. The Cold War had impacted way past America and the USSR. More particularly, in Guyana and Venezuela case, the concerns of the United States was the emergence of communism. Don't forget that they had decided that they have to contain communism.
Yeah, the McCarthyism.
Correct. At the time, Dr. Jagan was in power in Guyana, and the concern was the spread of communism. Castro had already come to power in Cuba. In Venezuela itself, the left wing was taking on the regime.
I guess we had a series of leftist governments in the region.
So the point is, it is in this period of the clash of East and West, all the documents will show that Venezuela and to some extent Suriname were encouraged to be involved in these claims. In 1962, after the death of one Malay Provo, who was a junior lawyer in the Venezuelan team, he left a note which suggested that this claim that the note should not be opened until his death. After his death, the note was opened in 1962, in which he contended that there was a deal between the powers and Venezuela lost territory. Now, it is based on this posthumous
He's talking
note,
about a deal that was made in 1899.
1899. He was saying it wasn't a proper arbitral award, it was a deal between the powers, and as a result, Guyana got territory. I don't have the time to go through to show you that if you follow all the historical evidence, Guyana would have had more territory because Guyana lost territory in the process.
Indeed.
Something that people don't know. But what is critical is that the issue was reopened. And when the issue was reopened, Dr. Jagan was in power. Guyana became independent in 1966, but there was a change of government in 1964. In 1966, what the Guyana government, the Venezuela government agreed to is to set up a mixed commission under the Geneva Agreement of 1966. And the Geneva Agreement set out a number of approaches that could be taken to deal with the issue. Guyana and Venezuela never really actually agreed. I want to read for you what the actual first article in the agreement says.
What's this book, so anyone looking can...
It's a Geneva Agreement, but the book is Anglo-American Diplomacy in the Reopening of the Guyana-Venezuela Border Controversy 1961-1966 by a renowned Guyanese historian and diplomat, Cedric Joseph.
Fantastic.
But it says in Article 1, a mixed commission shall be established with the task of seeking satisfactory solution for the practical settlement of the controversy between Venezuela and the United Kingdom, which has arisen as a result of the Venezuelan contention that the arbitral Award of 1899 about the frontiers between British Guyana and Venezuela is null and void. Now, I want you to recognize that the agreement says, the article says, the contention. Guyana's position is that the arbitral award was full, final,
and binding. And
therefore, for Guyana and most of the world, the question of the territory in Guyana had been settled in 1899. What Guyana indicated through the Geneva Agreement is a willingness to discuss Venezuela's claim that the arbitral award was null and void. Now, this is very important because even now as we talk and the government speaks about going to arbitration, a lot of people running away with the impression that it is the question of the 1899 arbitral award that is going to go. The answer to that is a clear no. What is going to go is the contention by Venezuela that the arbitral award is null and void. When they contended that, under the Geneva Agreement, the mixed commission met, and Venezuela had the task of establishing that it was null and void. Up until daylight today, they have never produced one iota of fact.
In no international
nowhere to suggest that the arbitral award of 1899 is null and void. It is well known, and that is why Guyana continues to say it's a controversy and not a border issue, because the border has been settled, but there's a controversy over this claim by Venezuela that there was some plot. So when one looks at the entire picture, the border was settled in 1899. Guyana continues to say and establish that the border is settled. If you look at all the resolutions passed in the UN, etc., and in CARICOM, Guyana has always been supported on this position that the matter was settled in 1899 by an arbitral award. What Venezuela does now is prolong it and seems to be building up in the psyche of its people a position that Essequibo belongs to them. There are a lot of historical data. For instance, the book that I just referred to will show that long after that Guyana was Dutch, and for instance in the Pomeroon, the Dutch had settlements, which gives credence to the fact that that area belonged to Guyana. But I don't have the time to go through all the details.
It's a very detailed history.
A lot of the evidence in history will establish that the arbitral award of 1899 was final, and that Venezuela acted for many years based on that and never challenged Guyana's territory.
And it was only during the Cold
War era. Now, one of the mistakes made is Dr. Jagan and company was saying because it emerged in the Cold War, when the Cold War ended would end. What I think they miss is that controversies tend to take on a life of their own. And even though it was caused by a particular situation, it metamorphosized in the new situation.
Okay, well, we'll come back in a second and we'll continue this discussion with Mr. Aubrey Norton and Mr. Rawle Lucas. Back in a minute after these quick messages. And we're back in the studio with the Off Defense panel discussion group for today. We've got once again Mr. Aubrey Norton, former UG lecturer and Foreign Service officer, and we've got with us Mr. Rawle Lucas, lecturer and columnist at the University of Guyana. In the first segment of the show, Mr. Norton gave us a bit of historical context behind the Guyana-Venezuela border conflict or dispute, stating that in 1899, he covered that in 1899, the declaration that was made, or rather the decision made by the tribunal, is still binding for Guyana. Rather, Venezuela has a contention with the details this issue. So the question I'd pose to you first, Mr. Lucas, is why then, if this was decided, why do you think Guyana agreed to even give an ear or to even say we would consider having discussions? Do you think that opened the door that Mr. Norton was talking about, whereby the controversy now has taken on a life of its own?
Well, first of all, let me thank you for inviting me to
thank you for coming to
participating.
Share your knowledge.
But let me go back a little bit to something that Aubrey said, and then I will come forward to the particular question that you asked. I think it's important to recognize that, for a very long time, in fact, starting from around 1859, Venezuela kept asking the United States of America to help it resolve this border issue, at that time, of course, with the British. And I think they intensified their efforts starting around 1876, repeatedly pressuring, the U.S. to try and help them to resolve this issue. So in 1897, when the U.S. Congress agreed to set up the commission, I think everyone felt satisfied, including Venezuela. And so they put together the 1899 tribunal, which Aubrey talked about, and arrived at the decision of 1899.
So even the composition of the tribunal wasn't as a result of Guyana pursuing this?
No, this was Venezuela. This was Venezuela pushing for the tribunal, and the British eventually accepting that. So by 1899, you had this tribunal, and it had its decision, which was made as a full, final, and perfect settlement to the borders between Guyana, Venezuela, and Brazil. What we also need to keep in mind was that in 1904, Venezuela participated in the marking of those borders with Brazil and with the British. So Venezuela is fully aware of where those lines are and what it accepted and what it did not get.
So it participated, because I know some people later on will be talking about a Venezuelan advocacy or rather pressure group that's very much behind this this belief that Essequibo belongs to them. So I wanted very clear what you said there, that Venezuela actually participated in the delineation of these borders after this 1899 declaration.
Precisely.
Right?
1905.
And in 1905, it agreed to the maps that you and I know of as depicting Guyana, Brazil, and Venezuela. So, I think one needs to keep in mind, therefore, that there was a clear recognition and understanding of what came out of the 1899 award. What we need to be aware of, too, is that the Venezuelan representatives, I think the opening statement by the Venezuelan representative, if I'm not mistaken, lasted about 15 days on this issue. So it's not a case that Venezuela did not have an opportunity to present its arguments before the tribunal, and that somebody tried to scuttle what it was a full process that they had available to them.
If there was YouTube, then I would have put the links up to share the video with the people at home. But that's very important. Something like an opening statement lasting 15 days. I don't see how one could come to the conclusion that the issue wasn't sounded to its depths. So then, to the question of why Guyana, therefore, after such a thorough process, which began in 1856 or thereabouts, after such a thorough process of requesting support from the international community, getting some headway with the convening of a tribunal to assess and make decisions, proclaim on this case, and then the decision of 1899, then further endorsement, as you say, in 1905. Why did Guyana agree to even recognize? Did we not potentially see that as opening a can of worms, which you could arguably say has been opened?
Well, I think you also have to bear in mind the sequence of events. Even though the Geneva Agreement was agreed to in 1966, and Guyana gained independence in 1966, we might believe that Guyana was independent at the time the accord was signed, but it was not. The British were the ones who was leading the negotiations, but Guyana participated because it involved them, and they were indeed on the eve of independence. So you had both the premier at the time, who was Forbes Burnham, and you had the leader of the opposition, who was Cheddi Jagan, Dr. Cheddi Jagan. They both were in London for the talks on the border issue.
So it's also important to know that it started with Dr. Jagan in power. And then when it started with Dr. Jagan in power, in 1964, the PPP lost government and a coalition government came to power, which included the United Force and the PNC. It is well known that the UF is very closely related to the British Americans. More importantly, one needs to underscore the fact that though the British started with the position that it was final, when you go through the documentation, there was constant pressure from the United States of America, because America was concerned about communism.
I see.
And the constant pressure from the United States of America caused the British to come around to the American position and create the framework within which the Geneva Agreement emerged. I think also that Burnham was conscious of the fact that he was taking over a controversy without having a diplomatic goal. Remember, what you would have been doing at this time was, one, moving to independence, two, taking over your diplomacy as a young nation. The question is, Burnham puts it nicely when he asked the question, when Dr. Jagan said that we should never have opened the agreement, opened the discussion. Burnham was very careful. We're not opening the arbitral award, we're opening the contention. And Burnham put it nicely when he said, it is better to survive sensibly than court heroic death. Because the truth of the matter is, had you gone the way of the pig-headed approach and not negotiated, making concession, you would have played right into the hands of the Americans and the Venezuelans. And I think it is in that context that Burnham decided that the best way to go was through the peaceful route, through the mixed commission, and let us negotiate, but choose the language of the agreement to ensure that you are going to discuss the contention and not the contract.
Well, I would say also that, you know, his view, Burnham's view of the controversy was protected, I think, also by, you know, two important principles in international law. One was the principle of good neighborliness, and the other one, of course, is that of universality, in the sense that he recognized to protect the territory of Guyana, and as Aubrey said, a young nation without a diplomatic service or even a military of anything, you know, to shout about, you had to find principles in international law that regulated the behavior of states, and one of them was the good neighborliness principle. So one of the things you will find then is, I think, almost shortly after he became the premier of Guyana, I think he visited Venezuela as part of that initiative, to deal with, to set up, you know, to set up the conditions for reasonably good relations with Venezuela. And as soon as we became independent, he opened missions in the three border states of Brazil, Venezuela, and Suriname.
But it hasn't always stayed within the diplomatic field, as it were. We know that historically, right around this time, Dave Martin wrote his famous Not to Blade the Grass song that everyone knows. There were some military maneuverings around a piece of territory. an island that Venezuela...
Half of the island.
Half of the island, and Coco Island. So that happened then. I know Guyanese troops were mobilized to the border, most naturally. And once again, we find ourselves today in a position where recent reports indicate there's been a lot of mobilization of troops, of Venezuelan troops and surface-to-air missiles and the like to the border. So this is, one could say, resultant of that kind of worms having been opened. Though I understand what you're saying in that it was better to survive as a country than die this heroic death you're speaking about. But do you fear the situation becoming more aggressive, especially given our recent...
But you have to keep in mind that it was not just Guyana and Venezuela. The British were the ones leading the conversation. So I'm saying to you,
I understand that.
Guyana could. So there was no open decision there.
But this is now in, and I'm not casting blame. I was trying to understand why the conversation was opened up, and I think you've given a good explanation of that. And at the end of the day, the problem is now in Guyanese hands, even though it was the British who may have signed the declaration. And I guess my own personal view may be that perhaps the Venezuelans were intimidated by the size of the British Empire. Maybe that had something to do with them signing. And once Guyana was on its own as an independent state, in its embryonic stages, we look like a target. Do you agree with this, or you disagree with this?
Well, I would deal with it slightly different. I would say this. When one analyzes something like a territorial controversy, there are two options: the peaceful solution or the military solution.
Indeed.
You would agree that the military solution is out because of the pure difference in size. So Guyana's only option was the diplomatic option. If Guyana's only option was the diplomatic option, and you didn't have a diplomatic service, it meant you need time to build a diplomatic service. You need time to universalize the reality of your country. Don't forget, when Guyana would have become independence in 1966, Guyana at the time was virtually unknown. And
sometimes people still mix us up with Ghana.
No, the controversy would not have been in the international arena as such. So Guyana had to build a diplomatic core
to communicate this issue
and
to
then
the world.
Formulate clear policy positions to help you to deal with Venezuela and keep Venezuela at bay. My contention is Guyana has done a good job historically. It continues to do a good job because you could have had Venezuela going in the other direction, but because of the ability of our diplomatic infrastructure to mobilize support, we have done an excellent job. Note as well that it wasn't only Venezuela. At the time that Guyana was going to independence, the British was also experiencing pressure to deal with Suriname.
Oh, well, we'll have to stick up in there. I'm getting the eye from the producer. We'll pick it up from there when we come back, but back in a couple of minutes after these brief messages. We're back in the studio on defense, looking to come off defense with one more topic this week. We're talking about the Guyana-Venezuela territorial dispute. Controversy. The territorial controversy. I've been corrected. And Mr. Norton, you were just making a point about Suriname.
I was making the point that Guyana wasn't only taking on Venezuela. You had Suriname. And
with the New River Triangle.
Yes. And if you go to the documents, you will see that the British have said there was no contention about the New River Triangle. And they were all agreements that was there. In the case of Suriname, it is the war that prevented us from signing an agreement because it was already worked out. But yet that emerged in the 60s at the time of the Cold War. So one had to be very, very careful. Now remember too, in the era of the Cold War, if you were considered to be on the wrong side of the fence, you were invaded. There's no
blank, yes.
2-3 questions about that. And therefore, I think Burnham analyzed the variables at play and took the practical decision that Guyana's only chance of survival is the diplomatic route, and should eschew anything that can lead into a military confrontation.
So given that we have taken the path of least resistance, as it were,
Well,
to safeguard...
I would not be...
Not necessarily...
If you say least resistance, you are removing diplomacy as a form of resistance. Diplomacy is a form of resistance.
I mean, as opposed to us going to war, a full-out war, I was just making a comparative there. Diplomacy being the safest alternative, or the option which was most, I guess, was the best option on the table at the time. And I would say arguably it's still the best option on the table at the time, because if we were to look at the numbers, just on the figures, the population density, Venezuela has some 23 million people. I did some quick maths at home and calculated that if we got into a war, every Guyanese man, woman, and child we'd have to fight thousands of people. So before we all have to start doing the push-ups, I do agree that diplomacy is the best option, but given the recent mobilization of the gunboats, the grandstanding over the Exxon rig, and the previous to that the CGX rig, which tried to do some exploration in our waters, owing to the tensions that are building on that front, the mobilization of their troops, do you think that it will remain the most viable option in the future? And do you think it is time that perhaps we started to shore up or even develop our own military capacity in Guyana?
You have to develop your military, but you have to understand what is happening in the context of the present world.
Mm-hmm.
In the present world, Maduro is in trouble at home.
Economically. And
one of the old theories in international relations is when you are in trouble at home, you try to externalize it and therefore reduce the pressure at home. I believe Maduro is doing some of that because his regime is in deep trouble. In fact, if you do research on what is happening internally, it is being predicted that the regime is collapsing internally. Yeah. So I want to put that variable. Secondly, one has to deal with the changed international context. In the international context in which it emerged, Venezuela was an ally of the United States. In the present context, Venezuela is not an ally of the United States. I'm saying this to say to you that it's a dynamic process. And my own view is diplomacy has to be the way. And I believe in terms of diplomacy, Guyana has the advantage at this stage if one looks at the whole plethora of variables that are unfolding. Venezuela's economy is in trouble. Maduro seems very unpopular. The problems of the people in Venezuela, the U.S. position on Venezuela, a number of issues. To me, when you look at all the variables, Guyana is. And then we also have got to factor in Brazil. Brazil is the country that has every Latin American country on its border except one. What that means is that Brazil, I don't think, will accommodate territorial controversies because it has implications for its own existence. And so when one does the analysis, one has to contend that Venezuela is in a desperate position and Guyana needs to maintain calm. Guyanese, as the president said, Guyanese need to maintain calm and let the diplomatic effort be the key effort.
Yeah, no, let me come in here because I think it's important to recognize that you may have a number of variables that could interfere and disrupt even the peaceful process that we're pursuing. Because you yourself, in your opening remarks, observed that at the individual level, at the border, you have individuals who are crossing and interacting at the individual level with personnel in Guyana, whether it's civilians or the military. So we have to take that into account, because a skirmish there, a Venezuelan being hurt or something of the sort, could be a flashpoint for some kind of military aggression against Guyana and justification for then occupying a portion of the country. So that's an area we have to be very careful with. But as Aubrey was pointing out, I think when you look at the international level, we have to take account of what a number of important countries in Latin America have been saying since this thing emerged. I think the Brazilians themselves, when the ambassador presented his credentials, if I understood what was said in the press, he made it quite clear that Brazil was not interested in any kind of
redrawing of the map.
No, not only a redrawing of the map, but was insisting that this region remains a peaceful region, a region of peace. So that, in my view, suggests that from the diplomatic front, the Brazilians themselves would play a role. But I think we also have to watch at what Colombia is also saying, because Colombia, to the west of Venezuela, also has a problem with Venezuela. And they too are asserting that, this region must remain a peaceful region. So one has to watch that situation as well, because I think their interpretation of any invasion of Guyana by Venezuela could imply they must be ready for an invasion too. So I think they themselves will also try to make sure that that doesn't happen, even though they've had their skirmishes from time to time. Then we also have to look at what a country like Chile says. Even Chile, it has its own, border problems and so forth. But by and large, all these countries in Latin America are emphasizing one thing, and that is the peaceful approach, that this region must remain a region of peace. And it is based on the foundations of the principle of good neighborliness that we find in international law, that insists that as a principle, no country must attack another one for any purpose, including the purpose of settling a territorial controversy.
We know this doesn't always...
We accept that, but I think...
Add to it too, that when it comes to the sea, Venezuela is in conflict with a number of Caribbean territories.
Indeed.
And therefore, while it might, to you, it might appear to be a Guyana, we call it, it will engender CARICOM solidarity, because there are a lot of CARICOM countries that are also affected by Venezuela's approach.
No, I met...
most notably Trinidad and Tobago.
Indeed, who also, with their oil reserves, must be on edge as well. I spoke to a gentleman called Carlos Spick, a Venezuelan currently living in Boston, and a member of the group Mi Mapa de Venezuela, Incluye Nuestro Essequibo, which literally translates our map of Venezuela includes our Essequibo. And these guys were part of the group that came across that widely reported border incursion at Etirimban. He was part of the group that made that incursion. And I posed questions to him because they're thousands strong. They're about 16 to 20,000 people that follow them. They organize events in the diaspora. They're in primary schools in Venezuela, showing little children to draw the map of Venezuela that includes Essequibo. And you could say our pressure group, they pressure politicians and are trying to keep this controversy alive. And I put it to him this morning in a Skype interview, similar to what he said. I said, so what do you say to people's claim that given Venezuela is in such a tough economic and political situation at the moment. World prices are at record lows for a country that generates most of its GDP from the sale of oil. What would you say to others claiming that you're externalizing, finding someone to pick on, or perhaps try and get this resurgence of national pride stoked up by reclaiming some land that you say is yours? And his response to that was that because the conflict, or because this point of contention is so old, this is by no means the reason that it has come up. But what was the policy of Chavez, the Chavez administration? Was that any different? Do you see any differences in how those governments approached this issue?
Well, in my view, I think Chavez was one who took the good neighborliness approach to his relationship with Guyana. But to come back to the observation that your interviewee from Venezuela would have made, I think it's important for us to recognize that the identification and demarcation of Guyana's territory was no idle exercise. The British hired a German naturalist, a German. No, he was more than just a botanist. Okay. He was a cartographer as well. He had many skills. Robert Schomburg, and they gave him a series of commissions starting in 1835 to demarcate and to identify exactly what land they had inherited from the Dutch in the Treaty of Paris of 1815. So Schomburg actually used the methods of the day to do his search. And essentially what he did was he looked as far west as possible for Spanish influence in the area. He looked for Dutch civilization in the area. And, when he was done, as I might have said earlier, he had taken this thing out as far as, I think the area was called Esmeralda.
So, and you also said Guyana actually lost.
We actually had to give up that because, the 1899 award probably felt that, the justification was perhaps not strong enough. So I guess I'm saying that to point out that, the views that people might have today about the issue might be ignoring some of this history.
And some substantial history.
And some substantial history. Venezuela never, when the British finished, when Schomburg finished drawing or demarcating the area, and he submitted his proposal to the British submitted it to Brazil and Venezuela for their comments. Venezuela never made a claim against anything in Guyana for about 4 or 5 years after they got that thing. So, and Venezuela had diplomatic representation in London. The British had diplomatic representation in Venezuela when all of this was taking place. We lost an opportunity to resolve this issue even between the two territories because of civil disobedience that took place for a protracted period, nearly 20 years, on and off in Venezuela, that made it impossible, for the British to sit with them and resolve the matter. So, but when Guyana found gold in 1850 in the Cuyuni, Venezuela raised its objections. So ever since then, it's been resources in this country. That is what we need to be aware of.
You talked about this Venezuelan chap. I think our journalists need to ask them hard questions. One of the first questions they should be asked is to provide historical evidence against the 1899 arbitral award. Provide historical evidence to establish that they didn't agree with the 1905
boundaries or maps.
What Venezuela does is merely move on discontention. When Guyana went to the Geneva Agreement, Guyana agreed that they can provide historical facts to be looked at. They never did. The other thing is that they tried to avoid an arbitral settlement. The reason why they're trying to avoid an arbitral settlement, and they like something like the good offices, is that it keeps prolonging, but the critical issues never come to the table. I believe the Ghana government is right. Let us go to arbitration for them to give the facts. If they have any.
I'm not so sure that we want arbitration, because we recognize that Venezuela has already rejected an arbitration, and Venezuela was the one that was proposing arbitration in the Geneva Agreement, and we said no, because that is how we came up with some of the other mechanisms. Because we recognize that Venezuela is...
Times, if I follow the press correctly, they were saying, let us have judicial settlement.
No, judicial settlement is, judicial settlement.
Correct. Judicial settlement.
Yeah.
So that Venezuela will be compelled to produce facts rather than this approach of saying there was a mere deal.
So they will be compelled to come up with the goods, as it were.
But I think our journalists need to do a lot of research in the area and be able to ask the key questions of Venezuela.
Yeah, you also got to keep in mind too, when Guyana was about to get to become a republic, Venezuela once again raised its ugly head and made an incursion. I think this time they went to Etteringban. That's where they made the incursion, a couple of days before.
So this is something with historical...
Precisely, and that is why we shifted from the Geneva Agreement to the Protocol of Port of Spain, because in 1970, Dr. Eric Williams recognized, who was the former Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, recognized that, the Geneva Agreement, was basically collapsing, and we needed a new mechanism to at least keep the peace in this region, keep things in balance, and so forth. So he offered to broker an agreement between Venezuela and Guyana, which he did. And that is how we arrived at the Protocol of Port of Spain.
We should go on to say that that agreement, the Protocol of Port of Spain, what it did was to put the issue in cold storage for 12 years, 1970 to 1982. But then, when 1982 came, Venezuela said it didn't want to be involved in putting it in cold storage anymore. And then we had to resort to the Geneva Agreement.
So we seem to be having this pattern that whenever asked for the facts, the substantive documents to back up these claims, Venezuela either backs away from the table or we prolong this discussion.
Well,
we probably have
Well, they do two things. Not only do they back away from the table, but then they show aggression. Because, as you know, towards independence, they made an incursion into Ankoko, our half of the island. Well, and then towards Republican status, they made the incursion in Etteringban. As the Protocol of Port of Spain was about to expire, they flew a couple of sorties, fighter jets over Guyana. So what we have seen is that Venezuela has been using these soft measures to take advantage of Guyana, and every so often to assert its military aggression over us.
Okay, well, so, we literally have to wrap this show. It's been fantastic. I think just before we wrap, because we're gonna go to a segment where we have the interview with this Venezuelan fellow that's responding to some of these issues to get some of their perspective on it. But before we close, I want briefly comments from both of you on whether you think we have been doing enough or can do more in the future to ensure that the young people growing up in Guyana have an understanding of the history because something that became very clear in doing the reading and the like for this show was that the Venezuelans are on top of having their kids, whether or not it's a contention, right? They're on top of having their kids believe that this is land due to Venezuela and the like. And I fear in the future, it may harm us not having the knowledge or not having committed to making sure our young people grow up with this same knowledge. What do you think?
No, I agree with you entirely. If you are not informed of what the truth or the facts are about the situation, then we're prone to make mistakes. And given the fact that we do have an open border with Venezuela, where citizens of Guyana cross that line every day, virtually, in my view, it becomes important for them, every school child, every person in Guyana, to understand the issue, so that when you are presented with a set of facts by someone else, at least you have a reference point from which you can either form your own opinion or provide a reasonable response. So in my view, I think it's very critical that we, begin that process of educating our children about this particular controversy.
Well, I agree with Rawle totally, but I also believe the problem is wider than that. We need to teach young Guyanese history. You can have a situation, or you do have situations in Guyana, where a child goes to school and come out of school knowing something but Caribbean history.
Or even American history about
European history, but don't know anything about Guyanese history. I don't know that the secondary schools in Guyana teach about 1763 and all of those things. So to me, we need a proper curriculum for the teaching of Guyanese history, of which the Guyana-Venezuela territorial controversy can be one element.
So that wraps it up for this week in studio with Off Defense. I would like to thank once again Mr. Aubrey Norton, former lecturer and member of the Foreign Service, and Mr. Rawle Lucas, lecturer and columnist. You gentlemen have been a wealth of information. I thank you so much for coming in today and sharing it with me and the people at home. I hope that we set the tone and given those of you at home some context. Join us again next week on Off Defense, and in the meantime, I would advise that, like these learned gentlemen, you use all means at your disposal to educate yourself and those around you on the history of this controversy. I keep making that mistake, but you educate yourself on the history of this controversy so that at all times we are able to defend what it is we hear with facts, because that above all is important. Have a good night.